I did not primarily conduct business on email with officials in our government. And I made it a practice to send emails that were work-related to people on their government accounts. I did not primarily conduct business on email with officials in our government. And I made it a practice to send emails that were work-related to people on their government accounts.
Recognize the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Westmoreland.
Thank you. Madam Secretary, so far today I've said good morning, good afternoon.
You all serving breakfast,
evening.
Congressman?
So let me go ahead and say good night. You know, I may be the only person on this side that doesn't really care about your personal email, because I know that I think you said Colin Powell had one. The thing that bothers me is that it was a personal server. I think that's the difference, because Mr. Powell's emails all went through the State Department server. So just to clarify it, I think the problem is that you had the full control of your emails because they were on a private server and not the government server.
That any reasonable person in Secretary Clinton's position or in the position of those with whom she was corresponding about those matters should have known that an unclassified system was no place for that conversation.
The other thing I'd like to say is to Ms. Duckworth, if you would read the testimony of the number of diplomat security agents that served in Benghazi. Most of them were temporary duty, 45, 60 day people that served. If you'll read that, I think you'll find that a lot of these things that the Secretary said as far as enhancements,
that's factually incorrect,
was paid for by petty cash out of their own money, and not really fulfilled or completed. The other thing I want to ask you, Madam Secretary.
Will the gentleman yield for just 20 seconds?
Yeah.
I think that's why it behooves us as members of Congress to increase the security budget for the State Department. They routinely get less than they need, and I think that Americans in general would not begrudge more money for security to safeguard our diplomats.
You were able to find $20 million to support increased security forces in Libya, yet we weren't able to find money to support your own people on the ground.
But I agree with you that the report does say that.
Well, reclaiming my time, there was $20 million that she was going to send to Libya for their security upgrades. You mentioned the sixth man, that you had to wait on the sixth man.
The fifth man, I'm sorry.
Okay, all right. I was going to say there must have been somebody hiding in the closet or something that we didn't know about. You also said in one of the last things that the State Department sent more security from Tripoli to Benghazi during the attack. Mm-hmm. There was not a State Department person on that plane. There were 4 GRS agents and 2 TDY DOD people and an interpreter.
Well, that is exactly right, and that's why the cooperation and coordination that I've been talking about with Congress.
From all the information we've got, Mr. Glenn Daugherty is the one that said, we are going down to help our brothers. And he got permission from the chief of station to go down there, and he took 3 other GRS agents, and then he got the 2 DOD guys that wanted to go, volunteered to go, and they took their interpreter, they chartered the plane, and they went down there. It was not a State Department deal. And in fact, if you want to know the truth, the only option that the State Department had was the FEST team, as you and I talked about before. Now, you mentioned that it was for rebuilding, and I've got the State Department thing here about the FEST, and I would read it, but it's going to take up too much of my time. But there's not anything it doesn't say anything about rebuilding anything. It says that it's for crisis management expertise, time-sensitive information, planning for contingency operations, hostage negotiating expertise, which we thought at one time that the ambassador may have been kidnapped, reach back to Washington, D.C. agencies, and specialized communications capabilities. Now, that's what it says on the State Department website. And, you know, that would have been the one thing that you could have done to get people on the way over there to help those folks that were still in an ongoing battle that was ready to go, sitting there. But you know what? That plane never got out of the hangar. Those people never got assembled. And we've got a chain of emails that the first recommendation came back is the FES from your own people. And then the FBI told your employees that the best way to handle the situation was to send the FES team, and that was the way it had always been done. So did you make the decision not to send the FES team?
Well, Congressman, first, let me say that it's important to recognize that our Deputy Chief of Mission, Greg Hicks, was fully engaged in helping to put together the team that flew from Tripoli to Benghazi, and we were very grateful that the CIA station chief and his colleagues were behind that, and we were, very appreciative. They, as you know, didn't get there in time because
I didn't do it.
Because the attack on the compound was very swift. It was over in less than an hour, but they did help eventually to evacuate, and it was just an additional tragedy that Mr. Doherty lost his life in attempting to stave off the attack on the CIA annex. With regard to the FEST recommendation, everything you read was no longer applicable to our compound in Benghazi.
It doesn't say anything about rebuilding anything. It says that it's for crisis management expertise, time-sensitive information, planning for contingency operations, hostage negotiating expertise, which we thought at one time that the ambassador may have been kidnapped, reach back to Washington, D.C. agencies, and specialized communications capabilities.
Unlike the FEST team responding in Nairobi, where we were going to have an ongoing embassy presence, that was our embassy, the FEST team was very much involved in helping to stand up the communications and literally begin to get the embassy function again, despite the fact that Americans and many of the locally employed staff had been murdered in the terrorist attack. So it was our judgment that the FEST team was not needed, was not appropriate for Benghazi.
But you really didn't know what was going on at that point when you could have pulled
Well,
the trigger.
we did know. We knew from the reports we were getting back from our diplomatic security officers that they'd had to abandon the facility, that it had been set on fire.
Okay.
They were forced to take refuge with our CIA colleagues at the CIA annex. And remember, the FEST team is not an armed reaction force. That is not what a FEST team does.
Ma'am,
and
I
so
know that.
we had an armed reinforcements coming from Tripoli.
But that was the only tool that you had to get people over there yourself, not the DOD.
But
This
what
would
would
have
be,
been
what
something.
The fact is, we had 4 dead Americans. What difference at this point does it make? Sorry, Congressman. Look.
Evidently, it has served its purpose from being put in the different places it is responded to. But I want to talk to you just a little bit about your emails. And that is that I think you said it was October that you received a letter that asked you and former Secretary of State's to present all their emails. Is that correct?
That's my memory, yes.
Okay. Now, in August, the State Department met with your attorneys to talk about the lack of the emails that they had. Did you know that?
I didn't at the time, no.
You didn't know that they were meeting, that the State Department was meeting with your attorneys?
Not at that time. And as you also recall, the State Department was beginning to turn over to this committee my emails because they had between 90 and 95% of all my work-related emails in the State Department system.
But ma'am, they met with your attorney, and your attorney that they met with happened to be Cheryl Mills, which was your chief of staff.
That's correct. That's correct.
Now, is that weird that your attorney was your chief of staff, so that attorney-client privilege may have kicked in there somewhere?
She was my counsel before she was my chief of staff. She became my counsel again after she was my chief of staff.
Well, I know that when the email went out that night, it called everybody undersecretary, director, spokesman, and it said Miss Mills was counselor. It didn't say chief of staff. And that was the night of the attack. But let me just go a little bit further. You said that you found out in October, but your attorneys met with the State Department, I believe it was in August. Now, from that time, you said you turned over everything and that your lawyers went through this. And I believe it was in November, after finding out in October, that they had reviewed all these emails. Now, the State Department hadn't been able to give us all those emails in 2 years, but your attorneys, you must have some of the fastest reading attorneys in the world to go through that. And I know you've got a group of them there sitting behind you, but how many attorneys does it take to go through 65,000 emails in 2 months?
Well, first of all, the process to provide information to the Congress with respect to Benghazi started before I left the State Department. There was a concerted effort to gather up any information that might be responsive.
Did you tell them you had a private server at that time?
You know, I know that...
Well, if they were gathering emails, you had to tell them that you had a private server when you were there.
The server is not the point, it's the account. And I made it a practice to send emails that were work-related to people on their government accounts. In fact, and I made it a practice to send emails that were work-related to people on their government accounts. In fact, and I made it a practice to send emails that were work-related to people on their government accounts. In fact, Secretary Kerry is the first Secretary of State to rely primarily on a government account. So
I'm not talking about the account, I'm talking about the server. But one last point, and I'll close with this, and then the chairman can give you time to answer. Let me tell you what I thought. I think that your attorney sat down with the State Department, and they said, we got a problem. And so we got to come up with something that this is not just the secretary having these emails in a private server. So I'll tell you what, let's do. Let's go back and ask Madeleine Albright, who was Secretary of State in 1997, that never even had an email account. Or let's go back and ask, Colin Powell, Condoleezza Rice, and me to provide all this information. I'm just telling you, it doesn't smell right, and so I yield back.
Well, if I could respond, I think in the course of trying to answer and archive information, the State Department determined that they did have gaps in their record keeping, and it was much more than about me. They had gaps with respect to others, both other secretaries and others within the State Department. And the technology in the State Department, indeed throughout our entire government, is notoriously difficult and often unreliable. And I think it was the State Department's efforts to try to fill some of those gaps. So I didn't know at the time that there had been such a meeting. I learned of it subsequently. And when I received a copy of the letter that was sent by the State Department to me and the other 3 preceding secretaries of state, I immediately said, well, let's help them fill the gaps, even though I believed that the vast majority of my emails were already in their system. And we did. We conducted the investigation, the survey that I have described to you, and turned over more than 30,000 work-related emails, 55,000 pages to the State Department. 90 to 95% were already there. We sent so many that some were going to be returned because they were clearly not work-related. We did our best. I did my best to make sure that if there were gaps in record-keeping, at least my materials would be there to help fill any gaps above and beyond the 90 to 95% of emails that were already in the system.
Well, I'm not an attorney, but I think Ms. Mills is a good attorney.
Regular
because
order,
she never
Mr. Chairman.
told you-
At this late hour, I insist that 4 minutes after regular 10-minute time should be cut off with questioning.
The gentleman is out of time, just like almost every other member has been out of time throughout
Not 4
the day.
minutes out of time, Mr. Chairman.
Oh, you'd be surprised.
Well, it's a
Gentleman
late
from
hour, and
California.
our witness has been here for more than 9 hours. I think in the
And as
interest
soon
of
as the gentle
brevity.
lady finishes, I'll recognize the next member.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate that courtesy.
I did not primarily conduct business on email with officials in our government. And I made it a practice to send emails that were work-related to people on their government accounts. I did not primarily conduct business on email with officials in our government. And I made it a practice to send emails that were work-related to people on their government accounts. I did not primarily conduct business on email. And I made it a practice.
I did not primarily conduct business on email. I made it a practice. I did not. I made it a practice. I did not primarily conduct business on email. I made it a practice.